When we think about design, we, of course, are interested in new ideas, new approaches, realizing new opportunities, addressing problems. However, the question is, what kind of thinking goes into design, or what kind of thinking goes into design thinking? And that's in a way the key challenge that my colleague and friend Jens Martin Skibsted, who's a Danish design entrepreneur, and I decided to explore. This is a picture from the United States. It's a United States veteran. And a few years back, 2014-15, the United States Veterans Affairs was in a huge crisis. And now you think, well, that's just a government agency dealing with veterans, but actually it's the largest healthcare system in the United States, publicly funded. It's a system of services that deal with and cater to American military personnel and their families and relatives from the moment they even consider joining armed forces, to service, to coming back into civilian life, to retirement and end of life, and dealing with all the social and care and health issues there. Because of that role, it was also a little bit problematic that in 2015, it was made public that 40 veterans had passed away, had died, while on the waiting list for health services. It became a national scandal, and it became a concern for Congress. And there was a massive political pressure to change things and to not only make services available faster, but to basically rethink the role of the services in Americans' lives. And at this point, the agency decided to hire a chief design officer. And it became the beginning of a quite transformational journey to really explore what's the power of design, including, of course, service design, but also the overall mindset of design in really transforming such a huge and complex service as Veterans Affairs. Now, you are all quite familiar with design and service design, so I won't go into a lot of detail on the process, but I remember meeting Sarah Brooks, who led a lot of the work at the VA, and showing the mapping of the entire organizational structure of the organization that had been done for the very first time visually as part of the work. Obviously, they, as you know, from the design perspective, there was also work on user experience and service journey mapping. And now you're not going to be able to see all the details, but let me just show you what the service journey looks like for a United States veteran and for the Veterans Affairs. This is the journeys of veterans map from the moment of joining, and as you can see by the end of the service, the moment of dying, and then all the touch points and all the processes involved. And this is almost like the epitome of what design can do, right? To truly understand the impact of a service on people's lives, map it out visually, and then of course begin to iterate and develop and co-design multiple types of interventions and solutions that can help people. And this became the start, of course, of a journey for the agency itself to become modernized, to become digital, to be relevant in people's lives, to streamline its services, to understand what services it even provided. And in the New York Times, which had followed, of course, the case pretty closely, there was this article where the editor says, well, this is what's going to happen, and this is the journey that they are on towards the ultimate customer or user or citizen experience that's quick, convenient, and intuitive, and even something that you would want to engage with again. The idea in America that you want to engage again with a public bureaucracy in itself was kind of mind-blowing. So this is what design can do, and you all know that. And we've spent the last 15, 20 years, proving the power of service design for public services. And of course, we've seen the power of design in industry, the evolution of design. However, the question is, are there some limitations in design? And are there some barriers or some challenges that we may have not addressed yet? So what I want to do is to ask you a question to get us started this Friday morning. And just write in the chat. I may have to just stop screen sharing to be able to see the chat for a moment, but write in the chat just one word or one sentence that you see as the biggest limitation of design. We spend so much time telling the great cases, the good stories, advancing it, but what are the limitations? So let's just hear from you. And if you don't have a lot of experience, still think about maybe a prejudice or assumption you have. And so let's just see what comes up in the chat. I'll give you a couple of minutes, so no rush, but just put in anything you got. What are the challenges in design? Wow, I could even, I think already now improve the book just by including your comments. This could become a chapter on the challenges of design, right? Very, very good. Thank you so much for those comments and suggestions. Some, of course, have got to do with involvement of stakeholders and mandates. Some have got to do with how do you actually vision and become even more imaginative in design processes and challenge your assumptions, also modernist assumptions. How do you implement and scale and get practical? How do you do things rather than think? And how do you make demonstrations that can then empower decision makers to act or decide? Great, thank you so much for all those really relevant comments in the chat. I'm going to go back to screen sharing and then give a couple of perspectives that really frustrated me and Jens Martin as we started thinking about writing a book on the future of design. So our point is the following. Design thinking, and I'll use that as a term to sort of broadly describe the way in which we conduct and leverage design today across different types of organizations, including work done by professional designers, but also applying design approaches by non-professionals or those are in management positions that are in a way commissioning design. So a couple of data points on others who have pointed to limitations. Very famously, Natasha Jen here from Pentagram, the design agency, gave a talk a few years back where she said that design thinking is, I'm going to use an expletive here now, but bullshit. It's simply just hot air and not really truly anything that works. And her critique was, for example, the lack of critique in design processes and the sort of highly optimistic and sort of kind of just, paint by numbers approaches in double diamond models and so on. And so quite a harsh attack on the whole field of design thinking. And Roberto Vaganti, also a good friend, wrote one of many books, but this one, Overcrowded, where on the one side, he's addressing, of course, that you have a world with too much design. There's design everywhere. He addresses that the whole notion of human-centered design, user-centered design as approached by and promoted by, for example, IDEO and other agencies, really doesn't lead to any good design. It leads to, somebody needs to mute, I think. But leads to non-interesting products, not even very aesthetic products or services, and does not lead to radical breakthrough ideas, but rather design needs to, in a way, be returned to the creative designer as a way of gift giving and of really giving the love of an idea or love of a product or service to the customer. And ultimately, one of Vaganti's key points is that design is really the creation of meaning, and that's the radical potential in design. Just a couple of examples of critiques. There are many others, of course. One I came across personally was when I was with a large corporate organization, and they show around their innovation center, and then they have this quite small room with white walls and ample post-its available, and they open the door to the room and say, "Welcome to the design thinking room." and then it's just a white space, and then that's where design and design thinking takes place. And I remember thinking to myself, this has got to stop. I mean, now we've reduced the field of design in corporate innovation to a room and to post-its. So how do we take a different perspective, and how do we really explore what could the future of design be? So the perspective that we have chosen to take, Jens Martin and I, in the book Expand, Stretching the Future by Design, is in a sense to bring the thinking to design thinking, to go way beyond the idea of methods and the processes, methodologies. It's not that we don't mention methodologies in the book, but ask ourselves, what kind of thinking do we need to truly design and innovate towards the big global challenges and crises that we're facing? And so exploring what kind of thinking could really be relevant to draw on, and in that way answer the question that was asked to Charles Eames famously in the early 1970s by a French journalist: what are the boundaries of design? As she was getting, I think, quite confused by Charles Eames giving a wide-ranging perspective on what it is to design. And he famously answered, what are the boundaries of problems? And now, of course, there are problems that seem similar to the ones we faced in the 1970s, but there are also new problems or emerging classes of problems that are even more complex, even more rapidly evolving, and of course, a world full of that is connected like never before and full of technology that also becomes not always solutions, but also part of the problem. So in other words, as the boundaries of problems keep expanding, and as new types of challenges face us in the public sector, in businesses, we also need to expand the boundaries of design. And we must make sure that the field of design is at the forefront and in advancing before the problems hit us, so that we can actually design for the future we want. And speaking of designing for the future that we want, we argue that we have really become trapped by the technological determinism espoused by Silicon Valley. Now, so when we think about what kind of world do we create, we often think in terms of more technology, and we often think in terms of classical market dynamics, and we look to the technological research and also to the tech giants, the tech businesses emerging from California, basically, to show us what will our technological future look like. And that is an extremely narrow and limiting perspective on what the future could look like, both when it comes to technology, but also when it comes to ways and forms of living more generally. So how do we break free of that idea that we are caught up in a technological machinery? Whether that grows exponentially or not, it still seems to be going just in one direction. Because who says that technology will save us? And who says that more virtual reality is inevitable? Who says that there aren't learnings to be taken from other cultures or places that might give us other perspectives on who and what to design for? So the field of innovation, also coming from a design perspective, is really in need of innovation. And we are seeing an emerging world that is also increasingly becoming more multipolar. So moving away from the unipolar perspective of Silicon Valley to other areas and cultures. Just to give a couple of examples that are slightly radical perhaps, but think of, as we move around the world, where can you see some hotbeds of innovation, whether that is in Asia, whether that is in India, whether that is in Africa, Latin America, and even Europe or the Nordics. Ground effect planes, just as a technology example, who says a plane needs to go at 10 kilometers height? Or what about using ground effect, which is much, much more efficient for a plane? And this is something that's been pioneered in places like Iran and in the Soviet Union. There were visions about the internet way before we knew the internet. This is the, many of you recognize the Minitel that became like a nationally grown, highly linked infrastructure in France, and was in many ways hugely successful until it was disrupted by the real internet, you can say, and largely it disappeared again. Or what about getting to, well, I'm going to say get to Denmark, but could also be getting to Scandinavia to look at other ways of living and other ways of commuting and other ways of being mobile than looking to self-driving cars, which is basically the model and the vision of Silicon Valley. So we are arguing that we can go somewhere else. And everyone can, as Francis Fukuyama famously wrote in an academic paper, everyone can get to Denmark or get to Sweden, get to Scandinavia. That building a prosperous, happy, well-run society is a question of design. And that building a sustainable society that we are working on in our part of the world might also be a source for inspiration. And maybe if we decode the way we have worked with design and experienced design in Scandinavia and the Nordics, we could perhaps inspire others to take a different route. So this book is not about Denmark or Scandinavia or participatory design for that matter, but it is a question of imagining that there could be other models available, including the ones that we represent. Because the ultimate hidden truth of the world, of course, is that the world is something that we make, and we can make it differently. And this is even said by an American anthropologist and activist who has, pioneered radical thoughts, even to the point of getting thrown out of, I think it was kicked out of Princeton for his activism. We can change things if we want, and that is, in many ways, an ultimate design point. That we can shape our future, we can shape the model of society, we can shape how we want technology to be used or not used in our lives. So how can we expand the boundaries of design? How can we expand the thinking going into design? And by doing so, not only move into perhaps abstraction, but also to some practical things we can do also methodologically in design work to move in new and maybe more useful directions. We propose 6 expansions, 6 ways to broaden our thinking on design: time, proximity, life, value, dimensions, you might wonder what that is, and sectors. And let me go through each of them just briefly to give you an overview of what they might mean. And there's much more, of course, in the book, but these are just some examples. First, time. This is the new college in Oxford. It looks almost like a Hogwarts hall, the Hogwarts hall from Harry Potter, right? As you can see, the ceiling is designed and built with these beautiful, beautiful, huge beams of oak wood. That's great. What's not so great is that in the middle of the last century, the fellows of the college discovered that these beams that had been constructed in the year 1379 were now rotten and full of an attack of beetles. And the beetles had sort of clawed their way into the beams to the point where they needed to be replaced immediately. And the college fellows, the board of the college, were really at a loss, because how could they afford it? And even if they could afford this replacement of the ceiling, where would they find that quality and size of oak? And as they discussed the matter, and it became well known at the college that this is, a problem, the college forester stepped up to them. And he said, "Well, sirs, we was wondering when you'd be asking. As it turned out, in the early 1400s, a grove of oak trees had been planted on the college grounds and were growing just basically around the corner. And 500 years later, those trees were ready to be used to reconstruct the ceiling. Now, that's pretty long-term thinking, to plant trees in the expectation that they would be needed 500 years later. It's also pretty patient forestry service at the college. And so the question is, what time horizon are we designing for? And the critique inherent in this is that we often design for a much, much too short time horizon, not least when it comes to public services and public policies. And we also don't really reflect in many design processes what is the relevant time frame, or even the relevant time frames in plural. But most of the complex, wicked, long-term problems we're looking at, will not be fixed by tomorrow or next year or in the next election cycle, but may need towards 2030 or 40 or 50 or beyond to be addressed. And not often enough do we take that kind of perspective to involve partners and stakeholders in the process of design. Another example of this is from the Norwegian hamlet of Træna, which was basically dying as a place, as in most other small coastal communities, both in Norway but also around the world. Young people were leaving for education, population was aging, and soon there would just be no village left. And the local government hired then a project developer to bring in some fresh thinking and get things going again. One of the first things she did was to start a program for artists and residents to get practicing artists to the town and give them some access and space, and then suddenly begin to attract tourism and activities and engage with the local community. Then came the idea of a rock festival. It turns out that there's a cave nearby, which is perfect for running rock festivals. And it looks like this, and it's pretty cool. In fact, suddenly Træna got so cool again that delegations of city leaders would come to visit on study trips to understand the transformation. What kind of thinking goes into this kind of transformation? Well, this is what the project developer said when asked about her approach. Humans have lived in this location for 9,000 years. So why not design a society for the next 9,000? Now that's kind of expanding our thinking on time, both thinking about the past, which we often forget about in design processes, but also, as Moa Bjørnson here does, think very, very, very far into the future. Final example from the corporate world is the Danish company Grundfos, which you can see from the picture, deals with pump technology, basically providing freshwater and water technology to cities and societies around the world. And this is just to say that there are huge limitations on long-term thinking, and there are huge limitations on thinking about long-term impacts that go beyond the traditional metrics of financial numbers, for example. So the CEO, the then CEO of Grundfos, again, leading global provider of pump technology, Mads Nipper, he was quoted in the news for their vision, which was to bring clean drinking water to 300 million people by, a point very, very far into the future. And that long-term vision of bringing solutions to people rather than simply a sales target or growth target is something you cannot do if you are a traditional CEO in a traditional company. And as Mads said, with this kind of long-term ambitious vision for impact, if this was a publicly listed company, shareholders would have me fired. But the reason he could say it is that Grundfos is a foundation-owned company that can allow itself to take a long-term perspective, to not be influenced by markets. So there are barriers In the public sector, it would be typically around election cycles and the pressure to do a lot of things within 4 years. And for publicly listed companies, the pressure is, of course, shareholder pressure and quarterly results. So to expand time, we can go in many directions. We could, and these are just suggestions, could go from the very short term to ultra short term and thinking about what would happen in a design solution if we thought about rapid and fast processes, like, for example, in as we know, in digital trading. We could go from medium term, typical 3 to 5 year strategies or 3 to 5 year product and service perspectives to long to ultra long term. And in terms of methodology, just to not ignore that, we could use scenarios and design fiction as ways to imagine new futures and be inspired by science fiction. And also, as we design products and services, now I'm thinking also about physical products, we could think about not short-term consumption and obsolescence, but think about product longevity and even how can products and services contribute to long-term systems transition. Just a few perspectives on how could we shift our perspective on time. The second expansion, proximity. And I'll spend a little bit less time on each going forward here, just to give you a few examples and teasers on what this might mean. By proximity, we mean closeness, or a feeling of closeness to others, to a problem. And we believe that closeness is key to action. The feeling of responsibility, even of ethics, calling us to act and do something for someone else or something else. So here's an example of an activist intervention, a design intervention by the Icelandic Danish artist Ólafur Eliasson, working with Mini Gråsing, who's a geologist and a climate academic working mainly in Greenland. Now, Ólafur, the artist in this project, brought huge blocks of inland ice from Greenland, from the ice sheet in Greenland, to capitals around the world, and popped them down in town squares, like at the Tate Modern in London, or as in this image from the Town Hall Square here in Copenhagen, and just let the ice melt. And citizens could interact with these melting ice blocks that would remind us of what's going on with the climate. And as the ice blocks were melting, if you put your ear to them, you could listen and hear these small cracks and pops of air being released, air bubbles being released from the ice, reminding us that this ice has been trapped in 100,000 years or more in the ice sheet, and now it's melting, and the air that's being released, the air that we are suddenly releasing and we are messing with by changing the climate, is 100,000 years old or more. As Ólafur says, when we interviewed him for the book, if you combine sensory and first-hand experiences, classic design, combining with knowledge-based and cognitive experiences, the knowledge we have from the climate panel, for example, on what's going on in the world, you're more likely to find behavior change. And so with design interventions, we can introduce tactile, concrete, specific experiences that, combined with more abstract knowledge, hopefully can spur more action. I'm not saying that we'll solve the climate crisis just by popping blocks of ice in squares around the world, but we can galvanize and mobilize more awareness. Another example of proximity and closeness is the Red Cross, which works, of course, to contribute to conflicts around the world, including often servicing refugee camps. They created here in Copenhagen an experience center where you put on rubber boots and you walk through an immersive experience that's both physical and digital, and including some VR. To me, when I tried it, the biggest experience was really the boots, because when you put them on, they are soggy, they are soft inside, like you're walking in mush, like walking in some kind of swamp. And the reason they're designed that way is that that's apparently the way it feels like to walk around in a refugee camp, basically anywhere on the planet. All refugee camps are the same. The ground very quickly gets very, very nasty and very, very soggy. Again, walking in other people's shoes, in this case, in refugee camps, interacting with voices and experiences and stories from refugees, understanding the work, of course, also of the Red Cross, intended to give thousands and thousands of visitors the experience and help them better understand the impact on people's lives it is to be a refugee, but also the impact that the Red Cross can have, and why, of course, ultimately somebody should support them. The experience manager there says that it's all about giving people a voice in different ways to create empathy, and empathy as the basis for action. Again, I don't think that experience centers will solve a refugee crisis or get enough awareness necessarily, but it is a approach, a tool to increase proximity. So we have to ask ourselves, as we create interventions, also in public services, how do we create experiences of closeness to drive empathy and action? How do we create those experiences intentionally? And how do we design for that? These are just some of the expansions we need when it comes to proximity, getting us close to all humans across gender, ethnicity, geography. It could be about reconnecting citizens with political decision makers, as, by the way, many labs are doing, including Experio Lab. So how do you use design methods to really connect citizens and policymakers, for example, in co-design processes? How do you go from these analytical linear approaches to also use scenarios and design fiction to put ourselves close to a different future? That's also part of proximity and connected to the time dimension. And also, proximity is not just about being close or feeling close and having empathy with people. It's also about feeling close to and having empathy with nature. There was a breakthrough recently that finding out that trees basically have a heartbeat. They have a rhythm in the way they metabolize and use water. And understanding just that nature around us have heartbeats might be one way to work on stimulating a feeling of proximity and responsibility to act ethically when it comes to nature. Life, expanding our perspective on life. What does that mean? Well, that can go in many, many different directions, just to stimulate our thinking on what do we mean by life. One is that we are beginning to see people taking on long life, also digitally. This is a platform that allows you to upload your digital avatar and really create a artificial intelligence-driven version of yourself, so you can live digitally forever. Now, that's really stretching our thinking about what it means to be alive. For example, if you talk about aging or talk about critically ill patients, what would it mean for them to take on a digital afterlife? We're, of course, seeing robotics emerging that are becoming more and more lifelike, to the point where we might start asking ourselves whether we would take this one for a walk, or whether we would have, at some point, robots taking our regular dogs for a walk. Life is also about how we think about materiality. So increasingly, designers are looking to organic materials for designing solutions in the built environment. This is a mushroom. Yes, it's also below it is mycelium, which is the web and network of fibers that these kinds of mushrooms create. And mycelium has now become a living organic material being used in construction industry. And we're exploring also in some of the work we're doing at the Danish Design Center, how can you, like here, prototype and build physical structures out of living organic material? We also see blend material between cement and organics, which means that cement or walls in buildings could repair themselves. Now, how would you design with that kind of capability in the future? So we're just asking with life, what does it mean to be alive? Who are we designing for? And how do we think more broadly about getting all living things involved in a design process? It could both be to go beyond today's lifespan to ultra long lifespans, whether that's biological or digital. It could be expanding from dead materials to living organisms. And more generally, it's really about going from human-centered design to life-centered design and realizing we need to design for all living things. Maybe that even becomes a question of asking ourselves, how do we design for post-humanity? Some are already saying that we should design for the time when humans are not here anymore. That's a slightly scary perspective. Value. So how do we expand our thinking on value? And this I think will be familiar to many of you, because when you are working in the public sector, you are aware that there's more value than finances or money. even though also in government, we can end up spending more time on budgets and input factors than on outcomes and what difference our services and policies are making in people's lives. When it comes to value, and this goes for the private sector, but also actually for many, many, many public services, that we have simply hardwired waste into our way of doing business, whether that is hospitals producing incredible amounts of wasteful plastics and other types of waste, or whether it is companies that are not thinking about their packaging and thinking about their environmental footprint. So how do we go from the idea of extracting value and discarding things that are valuable to a much more circular approach? How do we take a responsibility for value creation that goes way beyond take, make, and waste approaches? This is just an example from a hospital in Taipei, where the design company Minitel basically created a whole ICU during the COVID crisis, designed with and created with a recycled, upcycled plastics material. That's a pretty radical use of waste, especially during a crisis, and a lot of imagination going into that one. So how do we rethink what's valuable, and how do we do that beyond economics? How do we go and look at impacts that are both environmental but also social impacts? How do we expand that perspective, and how do we bake that into also policy processes? An example of that is a program we are involved in with the Danish Design Center with about 25 European and Danish partners, namely the new European Bauhaus program from the European Union. Now, the Bauhaus, of course, as some of you will know, is the original German architecture and design and art school, founded in Dessau originally, and discontinued by the Nazis in the early 30s, but that had, during its lifespan, an incredible impact on modernism and on the world we've built today. Also, a world that in many ways is quite problematic, and there were problematic things about not only the Bauhaus, but its legacy. However, the inspiration here is, if we are to design for sustainable, climate neutral, socially inclusive, responsible future, especially in our urban and built environments, might we be inspired by the Bauhaus to create a new Bauhaus that brings aesthetics and design and responsibility into how we transition our cities to be climate neutral. And what's important here to me is that the value that's thought of in this very sort of flagship initiative that's been launched by Commission President von der Leyen is to balance climate impact with social responsibility and inclusion, especially of citizens and youth, with, of course, thinking also about what new markets and new business opportunities are there for companies around Europe and also globally to find the solutions we need to the creating what we call an irresistible circular society, a society that's attractive and meaningful and we want to live in. And by the way, this is anchored in a 2050 vision for 100 climate neutral cities in Europe. So it's also a very nice and long-term project. But thinking about value and integrating different kinds of value, I think has been inspiring to see, and is I think, the right way to go. So going when it comes to businesses, but also public institutions, from linear business models and linear ways of working to circular ones, to thinking of value creation not as something transactional, but something as systemic and networked. And also, and this is maybe not so relevant for you, but also rethink intellectual property and say, how do we protect value? And do we need to always protect value, or should we actually open up more open source? Dimensions number 5. This is the 5th expansion. We are getting towards the last ones. What do we mean by dimensions? And here I just want to build on some of the thoughts from earlier in asking ourselves, how does technology and humans interact? Now, I'm sure you're aware that it's a very long time ago that a chess computer and artificial intelligence beat a human being at chess. So as the Silicon Valley gurus and singularians are saying, the machines will take over, they will get smarter than us, and we will just have to be, in a way, in service to them, perhaps. But did you know who can beat a chess computer? That is a human working together with a chess computer. So as it turns out, human intelligence together with artificial intelligence is actually even better than an AI on its own. And this is not just relevant for chess, but as we see an increasing amount of artificial intelligence and machine learning solutions coming and flowing to public services in local governments, in areas such as predictive analytics around social fraud, as we've worked on in Denmark in the municipality of Gladsaxe, or it is labor market interventions where we use algorithms to predict who will become long-term unemployed and who will not, based on a profiling of citizens. We have to begin to ask ourselves new questions about the interaction between humans, such as caseworkers on the one side, and AI-driven machines or software that makes decisions for us. How do we create that interactions in ways where we are informed by machinery, by AI, but not determined by it? And how do we bring ethics into our relationship with citizens as we increasingly use that kind of technology? How do humans and technology play together in the right way? Garry Kasparov, who was the chess player that lost to Deep Blue, said we need intelligent machines to make our biggest dreams come true. That is probably the case, but we have to make sure that these become positive dreams and not nightmares. So the question becomes simply, what will be the roles of humans in the digital world as we look to the future? And what will be the role of designers to design? And this is a very, very critical and important point, not least to public services. What are the roles of designers ethically as we design solutions with software and with digital services? Just because we can do something, just because we can profile citizens, just because we can make decisions with algorithms, should we do that? Should we do that? This is an example from the private sector where Philip Stark has designed an artificial AI chair. It's actually called the AI chair. I'm not sure how beautiful it is, but it probably will be well branded by him. But going to the public services, here's an example where we at the DDC have built a resource to really assess morality and ethics when it comes to digital solutions. And recently we worked with, we both had a visit from Swedish government, but also with local government in Denmark to explore what we call digital ethics. So expanding dimensions is to go across dimensions. I spoke a lot about human versus digital and human intelligence, but here a few other expansions, also geographically, we may want to think about as we have people venturing to Mars, and as we are expanding our design aspect for, what kind of size can we design for? I also think there's an interesting design perspective in moving from artificial intelligence as part of products to artificial intelligence as a partner in creative processes. More and more designers and architects are using artificial intelligence to collaborate with as they build specifications and build solutions, for example, in the construction industry. Finally, sectors, and of course, public sector is one sector, as we all know, but how do we expand that perspective? We're working right now on a number of different projects on the green transition, and I just want to share that because we worked on sort of the question of which sectors can save the planet. And turns out that we kind of need all sectors, right? We need the private sector, we need the public sector, we need research, we need civic society, we need citizens and citizen activism. So when we mapped out an ecosystem, it looked like this one. You can't see all the details, that's not the idea here, but the different colors represent different sectors and parts of society. And the dots also represent, the clusters represent different problem sets we're looking at when it comes to transforming towards climate neutral and green transition. And so this kind of ecosystem mapping, I think, will get more and more prevalent as we need to embrace the complexity of sectors and understand not just systems, but really emerging ecosystems, and have the capability also, not least in government, to really expand that perspective. The big question is simply, how do we engage everyone to address our thorniest problems? And how do we think about new hybrid forms of sectors? Something I won't say so much about now, but I think that the mission-oriented approach to innovation and bringing design into that kind of space could be quite critical, because missions argue, this whole mission methodology argue, and we say that quite a bit in the book, that by putting a long-term mission in place, for a huge societal impact, let's say 10, 20, 30 years down the line, then you are able to mobilize all actors, all sectors around the problem. And then we need to, of course, then design and build the entities, the governance and the spaces where we can make that kind of work. And we have to remember, and this is a quote from the mother of missions, Mariana Mazzucato, that the private sector is not necessarily the primary driver of innovation and value creation. And this should be a good news for those of us working in government, that we have to rethink the role. We also have to rethink the division of profits and finances. Often private firms benefit from government investments in infrastructure, research, education, and grants and innovation, and then private firms take it, commercialize it, and simply profit from it without necessarily paying sufficiently back to society. In fact, many of the companies that are most successful globally in using government-funded technology are also the ones that put their taxes in the tax havens and don't pay anything in corporate taxes. I want to conclude with a case from the DDC, where we're also looking at social transitions and in this case mental thriving and for youth, where what we're saying here is that as we go to look at how mental health can be addressed for young people in our societies, a huge problem in Denmark and also beyond, is that a question for the psychiatric system? Is that a question for how we treat young people? Is it a question for the education system? Or is it a question for social media? Is it a question for how we even think about the role of social media and technology and the companies that drive it in our societies? And if we're going to address that, and we're building a very big effort on this one at the DDC, we need to involve everyone, including social media companies like Facebook, for example, in the conversation, without necessarily being too optimistic that they will transform their business model to make it less toxic for young people. So just a couple of the sector expansions, going from public versus private to combining and finding new hybrid forms, to going also from traditional means of organizing and organizing for more interconnected sectors in what you might call a collaborative commons, building platforms and finding new types of governance structures, going from traditional legal governance to more agile governance, where many players together can set a governance field. Just some examples of expanding sectors. So, bringing all this back to action, as many of you said in the chat, how do we go from expanding our thinking into action? And my best bet at it for now is that by stimulating our thinking, we can power our design process, which we know quite well, in new ways that will get us somewhere else, that will get us to other kinds of futures. So 3 ways to apply expansive thinking in these 6 dimensions we've just talked about, 6 in total, could be to really use them to challenge our assumptions in a problem space as we frame a design brief, and as we challenge a problem we're facing or an opportunity we're looking at, and go through those 6 dimensions, those 6 expansions, and ask ourselves, what's the timeline? How do we think about proximity? Who's this really for? Do we include nature? What kind of sectors do we need to address in this problem space, and so on? Could also be as a creative fuel in ideation and concept development, in a way to stimulate our thinking and go beyond the scope of the ideas we typically generate in collaborative brainstorming and ideation processes. Or it could be as a frame for testing prototypes, to say, when we develop a solution, a policy or service, how do we actually test and challenge those assumptions and those solutions up against a more radically expansive framework? With that, thanks so much for listening to Expand and some ideas there. Thanks for joining in the chat. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.